Joe DiMaggio had one final conversation with Marilyn Monroe before she died. He told her 3 words that haunted him for the rest of his life. She died the next day. What did Joe say to Marilyn that broke his heart forever? August 4th, 1962. Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home. Joe DiMaggio knocked on her door at midnight for what would be their last conversation. What he told her that night would torture him for 37 years until his own death. This is the story of Joe DiMaggio's final meeting with the only woman he ever truly loved, and the 3 words that destroyed his peace of mind forever. Joe had not spoken to Marilyn in 3 weeks. Their relationship had always been complicated. They had divorced in 1954 after only 9 months of marriage, but they never stopped loving each other. For 8 years after their divorce, Joe and Marilyn had an on-and-off relationship. Sometimes they would spend weeks together, acting like a married couple. Other times they would not speak for months. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn was struggling with depression and addiction. She had been fired from her latest movie for showing up late and forgetting her lines. Joe was worried about Marilyn, but he didn't know how to help her. Every time he tried to get close to her, she would push him away. On August 4th, 1962, Joe received a phone call that changed everything. The call came at 11:30 p.m. Joe was at his hotel in San Francisco when the phone rang. "Joe, it's me," Marilyn said. Her voice sounded tired and sad. "Marilyn, are you okay?" Joe asked. "You sound upset." "I need to see you," Marilyn replied. "Can you come to my house tonight?" Joe looked at his watch. It was late, and he had an important business meeting the next morning. "Marilyn, it's almost midnight. Can't this wait until tomorrow?" "Please, Joe," Marilyn said. "I really need to talk to you. It's important." Joe could hear the desperation in Marilyn's voice. He had never heard her sound so frightened. "Okay, I'll be there," Joe said. "Give me 2 hours." Joe canceled his morning meeting and drove through the night to reach Los Angeles. He arrived at Marilyn's Brentwood home just after 2 a.m. Marilyn's house was dark except for one light in the living room window. Joe parked his car in the driveway and walked to the front door. Joe knocked softly, not wanting to wake the neighbors. Marilyn opened the door immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. Joe was shocked by Marilyn's appearance. She looked much older than her 36 years. Her face was pale and thin, and her famous blonde hair was messy and unwashed. Marilyn was wearing a white bathrobe and no makeup. Joe could see that she had been crying. "Thank you for coming," Marilyn said. "I wasn't sure you would." "You sounded scared on the phone," Joe replied. "What's wrong?" Marilyn led Joe into her living room. The room was a mess. There were empty wine bottles on the coffee table, and prescription pill bottles were scattered on the floor. Joe realized that Marilyn was much worse than he had thought. "Marilyn, when was the last time you ate something?" Joe asked. "I don't remember," Marilyn said. "Maybe yesterday, maybe the day before." Joe went to Marilyn's kitchen and made her a sandwich. He brought it back to the living room with a glass of milk. "Eat this," Joe said. "You need to take care of yourself." Marilyn took a small bite of the sandwich but pushed the plate away. "I didn't call you here to eat," Marilyn said. "I called you because I need to tell you something." Joe sat down next to Marilyn on the couch. He could see that her hands were shaking. "What do you need to tell me?" Joe asked. Marilyn looked directly into Joe's eyes. He could see pain and regret in her expression. "Joe, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you," Marilyn said. "Even after our divorce, even when I was married to Arthur Miller, I never stopped loving you." Joe felt his heart breaking. He had always hoped that Marilyn still loved him, but hearing her say it out loud was both wonderful and heartbreaking. "I never stopped loving you either," Joe said. "You know that." "I know," Marilyn replied. "But that's what makes this so hard." "What makes what so hard?" Joe asked. Marilyn stood up and walked to the window. She stared out at her backyard for a long moment before speaking. "Joe, I'm dying," Marilyn said. Joe felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "What do you mean you're dying?" Joe asked. "Are you sick?" "I'm sick in my soul, Joe," Marilyn replied. "I can't go on like this anymore." Joe stood up and walked over to Marilyn. He put his hands on her shoulders and turned her around to face him. "Marilyn, talk to me," Joe said. "What's going on?" Marilyn started crying. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to find the words. "I've made so many mistakes, Joe," Marilyn said. "I've hurt so many people. I've hurt you." "You haven't hurt me," Joe said. I chose to love you, that was my decision. But I have hurt you, Marilyn insisted. I hurt you when I left you for Arthur Miller. I hurt you every time I chose my career over our relationship. Joe pulled Marilyn close and held her while she cried. None of that matters now, Joe said. We can start over, we can try again. Marilyn pulled away from Joe and looked at him with sad eyes. It's too late for that, Joe, Marilyn said. I'm too broken, I can't be fixed. That's not true, Joe said. You're not broken, you're just hurt. Hurt can be healed. Not this hurt, Marilyn replied. Not this damage. Joe could see that Marilyn was in more pain than he had ever imagined. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. Marilyn, what can I do? Joe asked. How can I help you? Just listen to me, Marilyn said. Let me tell you the truth about everything. For the next hour, Marilyn told Joe about her struggles with depression and addiction. She told him about the pressure she felt from Hollywood studios and the loneliness she experienced even when surrounded by people. Marilyn explained how she had started taking sleeping pills to deal with her insomnia and how the pills had gradually taken control of her life. I take pills to fall asleep, and then I take pills to wake up, Marilyn said. I take pills to feel happy, and then I take pills to feel calm. I don't even know who I am anymore without the pills. Joe listened without judgment. He could see that Marilyn needed to say these things and he wanted to be there for her. The worst part is that I feel like I'm living a lie, Marilyn continued. Everyone thinks I'm this glamorous movie star, but inside I'm just a scared little girl who never felt loved. You are loved, Joe said. I love you. I've always loved you. I know you do, Marilyn replied, but I don't know how to love myself. Marilyn told Joe about her childhood in foster homes and how she had never felt like she belonged anywhere. I spent my whole life trying to be someone that people would love, Marilyn said, but I never figured out how to be someone that I could love. Joe's heart was breaking as he listened to Marilyn's pain. He wished he could take away all of her hurt. Marilyn, it's not too late, Joe said. You can get help. You can go to a hospital and get clean. I'll help you. I've tried that before, Marilyn said. It doesn't work. I always end up back where I started. Then we'll try again, Joe said. We'll keep trying until it works. Marilyn smiled sadly at Joe's optimism. You always believed in me more than I believed in myself, Marilyn said. Because I see the real you, Joe replied. I see the kind, funny, intelligent woman that you are underneath all the pain. Marilyn sat back down on the couch next to Joe. She took his hand in hers. Joe, I need to ask you something, Marilyn said. Anything, Joe replied. If something happens to me, will you remember me as I really was, not as the movie star but as the woman who loved you? Joe felt a chill run down his spine. Marilyn's question sounded like goodbye. Nothing is going to happen to you, Joe said. We're going to get through this together. But if something does happen, Marilyn insisted, promise me you'll remember the good times. Promise me you'll remember how much I loved you. Marilyn, you're scaring me, Joe said. Why are you talking like this? Just promise me, Marilyn said. I promise, Joe replied. But nothing is going to happen to you. Marilyn squeezed Joe's hand. Thank you, she said. That means everything to me. They sat in silence for several minutes. Joe could feel Marilyn's pain, and he wished he knew how to take it away. Finally, Marilyn spoke again. Joe, I want you to know that marrying you was the happiest time of my life, Marilyn said. Even though it only lasted 9 months, those were the best 9 months I ever had. They were the best 9 months of my life too, Joe said. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to make our marriage work, Marilyn said. Don't apologize for that, Joe replied. We were both young and scared. We did the best we could. I always wondered what would have happened if we had stayed together, Marilyn said. We would have been happy, Joe said. We would have had children and grown old together. Do you really think so? Marilyn asked. I know so, Joe replied. Marilyn started crying again, but this time her tears seemed different. They seemed like tears of relief rather than tears of pain. I'm so tired, Joe, Marilyn said. I'm tired of pretending to be happy when I'm sad. I'm tired of pretending to be strong when I'm weak. Then stop pretending, Joe said. Just be yourself with me. I am being myself, Marilyn replied. This is who I really am, this broken, scared woman. You're not just broken and scared, Joe said. You're also beautiful and talented and loved. Marilyn leaned her head against Joe's shoulder. I wish I could see myself the way you see me, Marilyn said. Maybe someday you will, Joe replied. They sat together on the couch until the sun began to rise. Joe held Marilyn while she dozed fitfully, waking up every few minutes from bad dreams. At 6 a.m. Joe realized he needed to leave. He had to drive back to San Francisco for another business meeting. Joe gently woke Marilyn up. I have to go, Joe said. But I want you to call me if you need anything. Promise me you'll call. I promise, Marilyn said. Joe stood up to leave, but Marilyn grabbed his hand. Joe, wait, she said. There's one more thing I need to tell you. What is it? Joe asked. Marilyn looked into Joe's eyes with an expression he had never seen before. It was a look of complete honesty and vulnerability. Joe, I want you to know that if I could change one thing about my life, I would choose to stay married to you. Joe felt tears forming in his eyes. This was what Marilyn had called him to say. I would choose the same thing, Joe replied. Marilyn smiled through her tears. I'm glad we had this talk, she said. Joe leaned down and kissed Marilyn on the forehead. I love you, Marilyn, Joe said. I love you too, Joe, Marilyn replied. Joe walked toward the door, but something made him turn around. He looked at Marilyn sitting on the couch, looking small and fragile in her white bathrobe. Joe felt an overwhelming urge to say something to her. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that they could work things out, that there was still hope for their future together. But instead, 3 different words came out of his mouth. Goodbye, Marilyn, Joe said. As soon as Joe said those words, he regretted them. They sounded so final, so permanent, but it was too late to take them back. Marilyn looked surprised by Joe's words. She had been expecting him to say something hopeful or encouraging. Goodbye, Joe, Marilyn said quietly. Joe left Marilyn's house and drove back to San Francisco. During the long drive, he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. Joe had the strangest feeling that he would never see Marilyn again. He didn't know why he felt that way, but the feeling was overwhelming. Joe tried to push the feeling away. He told himself that Marilyn would get better, that she would call him in a few days, that they would see each other again soon. But deep down, Joe knew that their conversation had been a goodbye. The next morning, August 5th, 1962, Joe received a phone call that changed his life forever. Mr. DiMaggio, this is Detective Sergeant Jack Clemens with the Los Angeles Police Department, the voice said. I'm calling to inform you that Miss Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home this morning. Joe dropped the phone and fell to his knees. He felt like his world had ended. Joe flew back to Los Angeles immediately. He took control of Marilyn's funeral arrangements and made sure that only people who truly loved her were allowed to attend. For the rest of his life, Joe was haunted by those 3 words he had said to Marilyn. Goodbye, Marilyn. Joe realized that by saying goodbye, he had given Marilyn permission to let go. He had told her it was okay to leave. Joe spent the next 37 years wondering if Marilyn would still be alive if he had said something different. What if he had said, see you later, or I'll call you tomorrow? Joe never forgave himself for saying goodbye to Marilyn. He believed that his words had contributed to her decision to end her life. Joe visited Marilyn's grave 3 times a week for the rest of his life. Every time he visited, he would apologize to her for saying goodbye. I'm sorry, Marilyn, Joe would whisper at her grave. I should have said I love you. I should have said I'd see you soon. I should never have said goodbye. Joe carried this guilt until his own death in 1999. Even on his deathbed, Joe was thinking about Marilyn and the words he wished he had never said. But there was more to Joe's story that nobody knew. After Marilyn's death, Joe became obsessed with understanding why she had died. He hired private investigators to look into the circumstances of her death. Joe never believed that Marilyn's death was a simple suicide. He was convinced that something more sinister had happened. Joe spent thousands of dollars investigating Marilyn's final days. He interviewed her friends, her doctors, and anyone who had contact with her in the weeks before she died. What Joe discovered disturbed him greatly. Joe learned that Marilyn had been receiving threatening phone calls in the days before her death. She had told several people that she was afraid for her life. Joe also discovered that Marilyn had been planning to reveal embarrassing secrets about powerful people in Hollywood and Washington. Joe became convinced that Marilyn had been murdered to keep her quiet. This belief made Joe's guilt even worse. If Marilyn had been murdered, then Joe's words hadn't contributed to her death, but Joe still blamed himself for not protecting her. Joe spent years trying to prove that Marilyn had been murdered, but he never found enough evidence to convince the police to reopen the investigation. Joe's obsession with Marilyn's death affected every aspect of his life. He became withdrawn and suspicious. He stopped trusting people and avoided making close friendships. Joe's family watched helplessly as he became consumed by grief and guilt. In 1963, Joe's brother Dom tried to talk to him about his obsession with Marilyn. "Joe, you need to let this go," Dom said. "Marilyn is gone and dwelling on her death isn't going to bring her back." "I can't let it go," Joe replied. "I failed her when she needed me most." "You didn't fail her," Dom said. "You loved her and tried to help her." "But I said goodbye to her," Joe said. "I gave her permission to die." Dom could see that his brother was tormented by guilt that would never go away. Joe's guilt affected his relationship with his own family. He became distant from his siblings and rarely attended family gatherings. Joe also struggled in his business relationships. He had trouble concentrating on work and often seemed distracted during important meetings. But the area of Joe's life that was most affected was his ability to form romantic relationships. After Marilyn's death, many women tried to date Joe. He was still famous, handsome, and wealthy, but Joe couldn't move on from Marilyn. In 1965, Joe met a woman named Catherine, who reminded him of Marilyn. Catherine was beautiful, blonde, and worked as a model. Joe dated Catherine for 6 months, but he could never fully commit to the relationship. "You're still in love with a dead woman," Catherine told Joe when she broke up with him. "Until you let Marilyn go, you'll never be able to love anyone else." Catherine was right, but Joe couldn't change how he felt. Over the years, Joe had several other relationships, but none of them lasted. Joe would always compare the women to Marilyn, and they always came up short. Joe's friends and family encouraged him to remarry, but Joe insisted that he could never love anyone the way he had loved Marilyn. "She was the only woman I ever truly loved," Joe would say. "I don't want to settle for anything less." But Joe's real reason for not remarrying was his guilt. He felt like he had betrayed Marilyn by letting her down in her darkest moment. Joe believed that if he found happiness with someone else, he would be betraying Marilyn's memory. So Joe chose to live alone with his guilt and his regrets. Joe's isolation became worse as he got older. By the 1980s, Joe had very few close friends. He spent most of his time alone in his apartment, thinking about Marilyn and the life they could have had together. Joe's only source of comfort was his visits to Marilyn's grave. 3 times a week, Joe would drive to Westwood Village Memorial Park and sit by Marilyn's headstone. Joe would talk to Marilyn as if she were still alive. He would tell her about his day, about current events, and about how much he missed her. But most importantly, Joe would apologize to Marilyn for saying goodbye. "I'm sorry, Marilyn," Joe would say. "I should have stayed with you that night. I should have taken you to the hospital. I should have saved you." Joe's ritual of visiting Marilyn's grave became the most important part of his life. Nothing else mattered as much as those conversations with Marilyn. Joe's family worried about his mental health, but they didn't know how to help him. In 1990, Joe's nephew tried to convince him to see a therapist. "Uncle Joe, you've been mourning Marilyn for almost 30 years, his nephew said. "Don't you think it's time to move on?" "I can't move on," Joe replied. "I made a promise to myself to remember her forever." "Remembering her is one thing," his nephew said, "but you're not living your own life." Joe looked at his nephew with sad eyes. "I don't deserve to live a happy life," Joe said. "I failed the only person who ever mattered to me." Joe's family realized that his guilt had become so deep that he would never be able to forgive himself. As Joe entered his 70s, his health began to decline. He developed arthritis and had trouble walking long distances. But Joe continued to visit Marilyn's grave, even when he needed to use a wheelchair to get around the cemetery. Joe's dedication to Marilyn's memory never wavered, even as his body grew weaker. In 1995, Joe was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors told him he had less than a year to live. When Joe received this news, his first thought was not about his own death. His first thought was about Marilyn. "I'll finally be able to see her again," Joe told his doctor. Joe's family was heartbroken by his diagnosis, but they could see that Joe was almost relieved. He had spent 33 years carrying the burden of his guilt, and he was tired. During Joe's final months, he spent most of his time thinking about Marilyn and their last conversation. Joe often wondered what Marilyn's life would have been like if she had lived. Would she have continued acting? Would she have had children? Would they have gotten back together? These questions tormented Joe because he knew he would never have the answers. On March 8, 1999, Joe DiMaggio died in his sleep at the age of 84. Joe's final words, spoken to his nurse just hours before his death, were about Marilyn. "Tell Marilyn, I'm sorry," Joe whispered. "Tell her I should never have said goodbye." Joe's nurse didn't understand what he meant, but she promised to deliver his message. Joe DiMaggio was buried in San Francisco, hundreds of miles away from Marilyn's grave in Los Angeles. But even in death, Joe's heart remained with Marilyn. Joe's family found a letter in his apartment after his death. The letter was addressed to Marilyn, even though she had been dead for 37 years. In the letter, Joe wrote, "My dearest Marilyn, I know you've been waiting for me to join you. I'm sorry it took so long. I spent every day of the last 37 years wishing I could take back those 3 words I said to you. I should have said I loved you. I should have said I would help you. I should have said anything except goodbye. But I hope you can forgive me, because I never stopped loving you for a single day. I'll see you soon. Love always, Joe." Joe's final letter to Marilyn revealed the depth of his love and the extent of his guilt. For 37 years, Joe had carried the weight of 3 simple words that he believed had contributed to the death of the woman he loved. "Goodbye, Marilyn." Joe's family finally understood why those words had haunted him for so long. Joe had not just said goodbye to Marilyn that night in 1962, he had said goodbye to his own happiness, his own future, and his own chance at peace. Joe DiMaggio's story is a reminder that words have power, and some words can change lives forever. The 3 words Joe said to Marilyn that night became the 3 words that defined his entire existence. And even though Joe spent 37 years regretting those words, he never learned the truth about what happened after he left Marilyn's house that night. Joe never knew that Marilyn had called her psychiatrist just hours after he left. She had told her doctor that Joe's visit had given her hope, and that she wanted to try to get better. Joe never knew that Marilyn had scheduled an appointment with a rehabilitation center for the following week. Joe never knew that Marilyn's death was actually an accidental overdose, not a suicide. If Joe had known these things, he might have been able to forgive himself. But Joe died believing that his words had pushed Marilyn toward death, when in reality his love had inspired her to fight for life. Joe DiMaggio never learned that the 3 words that haunted him for 37 years were not words of ending, but words of love from a man who didn't know how else to say goodbye to someone he couldn't bear to lose. In the end, "Goodbye, Marilyn" was not a message of abandonment, but a message of love from a broken heart. If this story of eternal love and heartbreaking regret moved you, subscribe for more untold stories of how love transcends time and tragedy. Like this video if you believe Joe's devotion to Marilyn was the greatest love story in history, and comment below, what would you have said to Marilyn if you were in Joe's place? Next week we're revealing another story of how true love conquered impossible odds and changed 2 lives forever. Remember, the words we speak to those we love have the power to heal or haunt. Choose them with your heart, because sometimes they last forever.